Welcome. It's good to have you with us. We're going to be speaking now with Daniel Greenfield. He is a remarkable contributor to the public policy debate, notably in his role as a Shulman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. You can follow his work there and at Front Page Magazine, to which he contributes regularly, and of course his blog, danielgreenfield.org, and his Twitter account at Sultan Knish, a man of many parts and a good friend of this program. We're always delighted to have him with us, though it's not been often enough. I hope we can correct that in the future. Daniel Greenfield, it's good to have you with us today. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, my honor to be back.
We're facing, I think, a bevy of things to talk about, many of which you've been addressing in one or the other of your platforms. I thought maybe we'd start with something that's very troubling about what you've written about concerning the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, and her seeming interference with the FBI as it has been monitoring, to the extent it has, black supremacists, like the one that is implicated in this murderous attack in Waukesha, rather than the putative, most serious threat to our country from so-called white supremacists. Talk us through that, if you would.
Well, what we're seeing is very similar to what was done with Islamic terrorism. The information about it, the training materials were suppressed. Even the very idea was deemed racist and off limits. Federal enforcement was prevented from learning about the threat, from monitoring the threat, from doing anything about the threat. The same philosophy was being applied to Black supremacist groups. Now, Black supremacist terrorist groups obviously have a long history of violence dating back to the 60s and 70s at the very least. Notably, Black Lives Matter, their iconic figurehead is a woman named Assata Shakur, who is one of the top wanted domestic terrorists in the United States. She's currently hiding out in Cuba. They use her slogan as their slogan. So there's a long history here. It goes back generations. But a number of years ago, Senator Cory Booker, Senator Kamala Harris, a number of other top Democrats, and a number of actually House members, including Karen Bass, who's now running for mayor of LA, began aggressively pressuring the FBI to stop monitoring Black supremacists. Now, the FBI had a category known as Black identity extremists. This was how they referred to Black supremacists. Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, a number of others insisted that there was no such thing, that this was something that had been artificially created by federal law enforcement, that they were classing together disparate incidents that had no common denominator. Now, this was obviously blatantly untrue because of the long history involved, and also because there actually had been a recent upsurge in violence connected to the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'm talking beyond the street riots, which had not yet hit critical mass at that point, but you had, for example, the mass shooting of police officers in Dallas, a number of other attacks around the same time, some of them fatal. And these were serious domestic terrorist attacks. Now, the FBI, of course, was quite willing to go ahead to cooperate and to drop the Black identity extremist category. And that was actually the exact intersection when you had an upsurge in serious Black supremacist attacks, a number of them actually originating from a group loosely known as Black Hebrew Israelites, not to be confused with Jews in any way. They're actually quite anti-Semitic, but it's a Black supremacist cult that believes that they are the authentic Jews, that everybody else is racially inferior and pretty much can be wiped out. People who have been around New York City, DC, some major areas occasionally encounter them doing their street preaching, which is violently racist. Now, in a way, this came up around the Covington Catholic case because a number of these people showed up to a pro-life rally and began yelling racial slurs, homophobic slurs at the students, instigating this entire exchange, which the media falsely misrepresented as in order to smear the boys who were there for the pro-life rally as being racist, when actually it was their own people, this racist Black supremacist group that was actually behind it. Now, a number of other more serious attacks began taking off at that point. The most serious of these was a major attack in Jersey City on a kosher market by two heavily armed gunmen, one of whom had a serious explosive device that would have been capable of doing a great deal of damage. They murdered three people. They shot a police officer before they were taken down. There was another attack also by a BHI member at a synagogue in New York. and there was a machete attack in North Carolina. But the Waukesha attack may be the single largest attack, certainly the most murderous attack by anyone seemingly associated with the BHI movement. Now, what was the FBI
This is
doing?
the one that involved, of course, the vehicle driving
Yes.
into a crowd of Christmas,
Yes.
celebrants. And Daniel, again, just to recap, these incidents are individually problematic, of course, but is it your view that they are indisputably joined by a common ideology, at least sort of black supremacist character?
Clear pattern there. Both the Christmas parade killer and the attacker in the synagogue in New York both used the same Hitler meme used by BHI members. Um, Certainly, they were all influenced. They were all involved with this black supremacist movement, and certainly they all held black supremacist views. Now, considering how loosely the media, Democrats, and even law enforcement now categorize white supremacists, where it takes very little to be described as a white supremacist. Kyle Rittenhouse was being described as a white supremacist based on no real evidence whatsoever. So, on the one hand, you have pretty much zero evidence required to describe somebody as a white supremacist. There are obviously actual white supremacist killers out there, but right now it takes pretty much nothing. If you fly an American flag, you can be described as a white supremacist. If you believe in the concept of individual freedom, there will be training resources that will describe that as a white supremacist idea. Pretty much anything, especially if you listen to somebody like Ibram X. Kendi, as white supremacy. So the bar is pretty much non-existent, whereas the bar for black supremacists is so infinitely high that no matter what you do, no matter how clearly you identify your political, racial, and hateful views, you can never actually be accused of being a black supremacist. Thus, for example, the New York killer who came in with a machete into a synagogue, he used the same meme as the Waukesha killer, was described as mentally ill. The Waukesha killer is being kind of written off as fleeing a crime scene, as doing anything but what he very obviously did, which is choose to drive an SUV through a parade into a crowd of people after expressing repeated black supremacist and racist views.
This fits into the larger sort of paradigm that we're seeing in this country with this endless incantation about the racism, systemic racism of the United States, and the character of it going back to its founding as a racist nation, with clear blind spots, to say the least, with respect to those who are advancing it. Do you concur that this is fundamentally a Marxist play, sort of akin to, not identical, but akin to that of the sort of class warfare that the Maoists used to such great effect in their own country, in China, but have been exporting elsewhere wherever possible, morphed to reflect the reality that class warfare is not a thing in the United States, not likely to resonate, but this racist warfare does?
That's exactly right. If you go back 100 years to the first black race riots, you'll find they were actually organized by communist groups. So much really of what the communists were doing 100 years ago in America then actually trickled down to the socialists and actually became a mainstream Democrat position. Thus, for example, the race riots that were originally organized by communists now simply become something that Democrats set off whenever they choose to. And as you very perceptibly pointed out, this began with class warfare, but increasingly as American opportunity equality prevented class warfare from being this defining Marxist premise. They had to switch over to race, but really their idea of race is pretty much the same idea of class. This is a fixed category. The only way to actually adjust it is to completely transform society, to engage in a revolution, violent or political, that will completely overturn everything. And anything that stands in the way is reactionary, and that we are moving to this inevitable crisis, this inevitable collision of races, which really was the selling point for the Obama administration.
Right. And one might argue was the driving force behind much of what's happened to this point in the Biden administration as well. Let me ask you about a character who plays a prominent role, often, I'm afraid, behind the scenes rather than in front of them, but nonetheless is perceptibly working in numbers of ways to advance essentially the agenda you just described, and that would be George Soros. You've been doing some research into his activities, notably with a group called the 1630 Fund. Tell us what it's about and what damage is being wrought by it with his financial support.
So the 1630 Fund is the ultimate dark money machine. They pumped about 400 million into the previous election, and they raised about the same amount. Now, they raised about half of that amount from only 4 donors. It's a dark money machine, which means they don't have to disclose their donors. But it was documented by Politico that 3 of their biggest supporters, George Soros, Pierre Omidyar, who is the founder of eBay, he was born to Iranian students in Paris, moved to this country. His mother actually funds a lot of pro-Iranian activism. And finally, Hans-Jörg Wyss, the richest man in Switzerland, who was actually not even a United States citizen, despite pumping hundreds of millions into the American political system, all for the left. He's the richest man in Switzerland. He lives here on an E2 investor's visa, which raises obviously serious questions. There's been an FEC complaint raised about this. Now you have these 3 foreign billionaires funding this dark money machine. Now, how does this dark money machine manifest itself? So you will have assorted front groups locally, like Floridians for Fair Elections, that are funded by this. You will have, for example, the Never Trump movement. The Never Trump movement is largely funded by the 1630 Fund. The 1630 Fund is the largest backer of the Lincoln Project, which was infamous for all these attack ads. Pierre Omidyar is the biggest funder of the Bulwark. The 1630 Fund funds Bill Kristol. So you have a lot of this so-called opposition, these so-called different factions, these so-called local groups, including a lot of fake local news operations. A lot of this actually comes directly from this huge dark money machine, which was free to pump 400 million into the previous election, and obviously going to pump a lot of money into the next 2 elections.
It sounds as though at least some of that dark money was actually illegal. You mentioned that there's an FEC complaint, a Federal Elections Commission complaint, but this would sound to me to be felonious if a foreign national is in this country or elsewhere for that matter, pumping large sums into political campaigns or processes. Am I missing something here, Daniel?
It is a serious issue. The question is whether any action will be taken about it. So yes, Wyss is not a United States citizen. He's not even a legal resident. His money over, I believe, something like 130 million or so was marked for non-electoral purposes. But when you've got a fundamentally political organization, one that obviously is engaged in the quest for political change from the radical left, there's really no such thing as non-electoral purposes. Yes.
Soros, an American citizen?
So George Soros is an American citizen, but I've actually found research that would suggest that he, on 2 counts, is actually not legitimately in this country. First, obviously, is the Nazi collaboration past. Most people know about that. That actually makes him deportable under the Holtzman Act. But another point is that actually he came to the United States in the 50s. He was around 25. The first time he applied for a visa to come to the United States from England, he was rejected because he applied for a specialist visa. At the age of 25 back then, you did not actually qualify for a specialist visa. And he received an affidavit from somebody in the financial industry. This affidavit made arguably false claims on his behalf. This is the reason he received a visa to come to the United States. It's the basis for his residency and citizenship in this country, which is really based on immigration fraud. And if we had a serious conservative administration, they might take a look at that and do something about it.
We didn't the last time around, and it remains to be seen whether we'll ever have another one, I'm afraid. But if so, this certainly ought to be a very important agenda, because what Soros is doing in so many different areas, I think, is incalculably harmful, and he shouldn't be doing it from here, that's for sure. Daniel, let me ask you one question that's more in the foreign policy arena. You follow closely, and I know feel as strongly as I do about the security of the state of Israel. How would you characterize the Biden administration's approach to Israel and Iran, for that matter, and the Gulf states with whom Israel had, under the Trump administration, been making considerable strides to achieve not just a pretty workable modus vivendi, as they say, a way of getting along, but actual Abraham Accords and so on. What's in play now, and where do you think this is likely to leave not just Israel, but our vital interests in the Middle East as well.
So the Biden administration is picking up right where the same people, many of the same people in the Obama administration left off. They're picking up on a lot of the policies of the Clinton administration. Their first goal was to overthrow the Israeli government, replace it with a coalition that includes leftists, Islamists, communists, that is more to their liking, which is what the Israeli government now is. It's this artificial hybrid coalition between a former right-wing party and Arab, Islamic, Muslim, including, by the way, the Muslim Brotherhood and an Arab Communist Party. It's a complete mess. The goal was basically to force out Netanyahu, replace him with a party that is more compliant. Unfortunately, the party can only stay in power by resisting some of the Biden administration's more extreme demands, including their bid to open a consulate to the PLO in Jerusalem in order to claim Jerusalem for the PLO. Now, mind you, when President Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem, he did it under the terms of an act passed in the Senate that was actually co-sponsored by a guy named Joe Biden. And this really shows the depth of hypocrisy of Biden, because at no point in time were any of the Democrats who voted for this willing to actually move the embassy. And now Biden is doing everything possible to reverse that. Beyond that, he's providing funds to Lebanon's government, which effectively means Hezbollah. He's empowering Iran. He empowered sanctions relief on Iran. He's trying to push for further sanctions relief. Now, Biden ran on the pledge to return to the Iran deal, but it's Iran that is actually holding out for an even better deal because they know that they can continue rolling the Biden administration as much as they want to, much like the Taliban, much like every other Islamic terrorist group has done. Everything that they've done, whether it's lowering sanctions on the Houthis, the various jihadist groups, and the Houthis, by the way, are backed by Iran, responded by escalating, by pushing harder. So the Houthis responded by attacking the former site of the U.S. embassy and taking hostages there. So their goal is to amp up the pressure on the Biden administration, and the Biden administration is fine with this because it gives them an incentive to make a deal, to make further concessions. They actually want to be rolled. They actually want to be pushed into making those concessions. This is much like the same thing that happened with the Taliban in Afghanistan, where what appeared to be weakness was actually an attempt to deliberately create incentives and advantages for the terrorists. And by the way, the Biden administration is still out there, is still making deals with the Taliban. They just returned from a negotiating session at the end of last month, where the State Department issued a statement praising the openness of the Taliban to dealing with the education for women and girls. Of course, we'll be funding all of that, as with everything else. Now, when it comes to Israel, the goal there, as with the Obama administration, the Clinton administration, has been to undermine Israel, to weaken Israel from within. They're going to fund various anti-Israel groups within the country, particularly with Samantha Power at USA. And it's also to empower the enemies of Israel, the enemies of any kind of stability in the Middle East. That means Iran. That means the Muslim Brotherhood. That means putting pressure on Egypt in order to let the Muslim Brotherhood take over there again. It means weighing in, putting their thumb on the scale. In Libya, it means actually going into Nigeria. They're actually trying to drop the attempts to monitor the Nigerian government's repression of Christians. So there's this larger global issue there. They're helping Islamists to go after Jews. They're helping Islamists to go after Christians. They're helping Islamists to go after any government that is not sufficiently radical, is not sufficiently Islamized. And obviously that is bad news for Israel. It's bad news for Christians in the Middle East. It's really bad news for America.
Well, that is a comprehensive depiction of the problem, and I thank you for it. The piece that I was particularly interested in drilling down on very quickly, if I can, and I think we're almost out of time, Daniel Greenfield, is the question of whether or not the policies that you've just described in broad outline, as well as specifically with respect to Israel, are likely to put the Israelis in a position where their back is to the wall. They fear, I think rightly so, that the Iranians will imminently have nuclear weapons capabilities if they don't already, and that there's likely to be no help coming from the United States to protect them against that threat. And therefore they must, despite the unlikely character and fractures in the Israeli government, take steps on their own to try to dismantle that threat. What's your sense of the prospects there?
Every reaction has an equal and opposite reaction. The Obama administration's championing of Iran, of the Muslim Brotherhood, created a situation where some of the former Sunni Arab oil states, some of the very ones that had been backing these various terrorist groups, these various Islamist movements, suddenly panicked and realized that their old game had come apart. They actually began building the Abraham Accords, the coalition with Israel. I mean, President Trump gets a lot of the credit, but really a lot of the credit goes to Barack Obama for isolating the Saudis, their various allies, for isolating Israel and creating a situation where there was an incentive for countries that had very negative relations in the past to come together temporarily against the common enemy. So when you actually have this kind of situation, unexpected things do happen. You have a reaction that may seem to come out of nowhere, but actually is a very logical response to the crisis. Now, the Biden administration has made it abundantly, painfully clear that they want Iran to get nuclear weapons. They're comfortable with doing that. And you're talking about Biden. This is a guy who, after September 11th, proposed sending a $200 million check to Iran, who was tied up with the Iran lobby when he first ran for president. When he was competing against Obama, he was actually attacking Obama for not being pro-Iran enough. So he's been telling Israelis for a while, back in the Senate days, Iran is going to get nuclear weapons. The Israelis know exactly what to expect from the Biden administration. They have absolutely no illusions in that regard. In some ways, the Biden administration is even more pro-Iran. What the Israelis are going to do about it is a question. In the past, there have been this kind of middle ground where they coordinated with the United States on sabotage attacks, some very effective, some very large scale, on Iran's nuclear program. Now the Biden administration is showing signs that they're going to pull away from the sabotage campaign altogether, which obviously leaves the Israelis, it leaves the various players from the Middle East with even fewer options. The potential collapse of the Abraham Accords would potentially be an issue if the Biden administration continues to push for this reconciliation, which I don't think is going to happen between the Saudis and Iran. Either way, the Israelis are going to have to do something about the situation. The question is whether their political stability is going to be there and whether the Biden administration is going to be as aggressive in trying to thwart any Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear program as the Obama administration was. One of the most overlooked stories in the Obama administration was that their espionage efforts before they were spying on President Trump, long before the kind of political office, they were spying on pro-Israel people in the United States. They were using the NSA to go after members of Congress who even had any kind of conversations with the Israelis about what it would take to stop Iran. There's little question that that kind of system can be turned on again, and the Obama administration was out to prevent any Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear program. If the Biden administration is not as careful, is not monitoring things as closely, the Israelis will have more of a chance to take it out.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, I hope that's the case because I think it's going to be necessary, but I fear that they will be assiduously trying to interfere with anything that the Israelis do, and that could put, again, our friends and allies in Israel in extremis and make, I think, that much more likely the kind of regional conflict that you've spoken of. Daniel Greenfield, I think we're going to have to leave it at that for the moment. I want to visit with you at some point soon about Ilhan Omar and what she has been up to in the Congress, as well as some of the fracases that she's been involved with, Lauren Boebert, among others, I think, in recent weeks. The problem of the Islamists inside this country is one that you have been, I think, very clear-eyed about and writing quite powerfully concerning, and we look forward to a chance to visit with you about that and much more in the near future. In the meantime, thank you for your time today as well as your insights on so many of these really important points, and we'll look forward to our next visit. We'll look forward to our next visit with the rest of you as well. I hope you'll join us again tomorrow. Same time, same station. Until then, this is Frank Gaffney. Thanks for listening.